Hi, my name is Maria Kadari. I am a first-year PhD student in cognitive science at the University of California, Irvine. And today I'll be sharing with you some very preliminary results from this work I've been doing in collaboration with some folks at Duke University. So this is a study on episodic counterfactual thinking, which is our ability to imagine alternative outcomes to previously experienced past events. And it's a mouthful, so I always like to start with an example. So I would like for you to remember the last time that you went to the beach and you got a really bad sunburn. And now I want you to imagine something about that whole situation that could have been different and that would have resulted in a less bad sunburn. There are at least two things that you could have imagined. One of them is putting on more sunscreen before spending more time in the sun. And because this is a CFT based on something you could have done, it's called a dispositional episodic counterfactual. Alternatively, you could have imagined that something in your circumstances changed, like maybe a big cloud just floated in front of the sun, and that's what mitigated the negative sunburn that you had. These kinds of externally based or context or circumstance-based counterfactual thoughts are called situational counterfactual thoughts. So this difference between dispositional and situational eCFTs is used a lot in social psychology research on episodic counterfactual thinking, but it's actually not known if there is a neural difference between these two classes of eCFTs and also like where those differences might be. So addressing that empirical gap was the motivation for this study. So we had participants recall negative autobiographical memories. This was over Zoom a week before they were scanned. And then in session 2, we had people remember some of those memories and then imagine better outcomes to those memories. So they were cued with a title that they came up with in session 1. And then we told them to imagine either a dispositional or a situational eCFT based on the trial. After they made that eCFT, they made 3 ratings about what they imagined. And they rated how plausible it seemed, how much under their control it was, and how difficult it was to generate that eCFT. And we randomized the order of these 3 ratings across participants and within a participant as well. And then in between trials, we had them do this up-down discrimination task just to prevent any kind of like lingering rumination or like further thinking about the CFTs between trials. So our first analysis of interest was a mean-centered spatiotemporal partial least squares or PLS analysis. And this is a whole brain multivariate analysis that constructs a brain task covariance matrix and then decomposes that to return latent variables that capture orthogonal dimensions of the brain task covariance. And this mean-centered way of doing PLS makes it a data-driven approach because it's just looking at the brain task covariance. We don't tell it any contrast of interest or anything like that. So each condition is assigned a brain score in arbitrary units. That's what you'll see on the next slide. That quantifies that condition's contribution to the whole brain patterns that have been associated with a latent variable. And then this is how we compute the p-values and the confidence intervals. So here we have data from our sample of 32 subjects. And you can see that a data-driven whole brain approach was able to return a significant difference between situational and dispositional eCFTs. And here we have a plot of the brain scores over time. So what we ended up doing when we were looking at the regions that were activated by each condition, we pulled out the regions from the 4th TR. So this is like right at the end of the CFT generation period, because this is the point in time when the difference between the 2 conditions was greatest. So looking at that difference, here's kind of a bird's eye view we saw that dispositional eCFTs engage primarily the cuneus and the middle frontal gyrus. There's obviously a lot more smaller kind of like popcorny regions, and we still have to look closer at these data. But those were like the biggest clusters, bilateral and really like 500 voxels or so in each cluster. Interestingly, none of the clusters associated with situational eCFTs passed the threshold for significance for reporting. So all we have are activations associated with dispositional eCFTs for the mean-centered PLS analysis. So obviously we've got to interrogate these data. So the next thing we did was look at the different ratings that participants made about the eCFTs. So the first thing we looked at is perceived control, which was kind of a manipulation check. So here you have perceived control on the y-axis with 4 being the greatest amount of perceived control. And we found, as you might expect, that dispositional eCFT, so based on your own actions, those were judged as being far more under the participant's control than situational eCFTs. We also found that a very small effect of dispositional or of condition on the difficulty of generating an eCFT. So that's what we have here on this y-axis. But as you can see, the difference is very small. So it might just be an artifact, but it also isn't super surprising that self-based counterfactual thoughts might be a little bit easier to generate than context-based. And finally, we have this kind of like Goldilocks effect of condition on these subjective ratings of eCFTs. And that's in terms of the plausibility. So here on the y-axis again is plausibility, and you can see that people did find dispositional eCFTs as considerably more plausible than situational eCFTs. So since this difference is very small, and this difference is basically the difference between conditions, we wanted to look at how plausibility might modulate the neural effects that we're observing. So we did a parametric modulation of this contrast, dispositional eCFT greater than situational eCFT, and we did find a couple clusters throughout the brain. It looks like it's maybe like some insula and superior parietal lobule, but like I literally just got these data a couple hours ago, and so we haven't had a chance to really look super closely at what the regions are, but the parametric modulation does seem to be a thing. And that's about all that I have for you today, that the mean-centered PLS differentiated between the dispositional and situational eCFTs. Dispositional primarily engaged the cuneus and middle frontal gyrus, and then the univariate contrast between these two is parametrically modulated by the perceived plausibility of the counterfactual thought. Thank you so much for your time. I would absolutely love to hear your feedback. These are super in the works data, like really we are knee deep in analysis. So I would love to hear any thoughts that you might have. Here's how you can contact me, and I hope that you have a great rest of Neuromatch 20.